Outdoor pottery firing gets a bad rap because people think it breaks a lot of pottery. But most of those breakages are preventable. And today I'm going to talk about the 5 common mistakes in outdoor pottery firing and how to avoid them. The first mistake I'm going to talk about is overfiring. This is when the pot gets too hot and the clay starts to break down. This is probably the least common problem with outdoor pottery firing. Most of the clays I work with here in Arizona are good at least up to around 900 Celsius. It's in that 900 to 1000 degrees Celsius range that a lot of clays start to break down. And that's pretty hot for an outdoor firing. It can be done, but you got to work hard to get it there. Still, I know several people who've had problems with overfiring their pottery in the last year. And most of that comes from either clays that can't stand up to maybe over 850 Celsius, or people are firing in different ways, like these charcoal firings like this can get really hot. There are 2 things you can do if you have this problem. The first one is to try changing to a different clay that will stand up to this pottery firing method better. And the second is to try to use less fuel to try to keep the temperatures lower. Also, learn to recognize the signs of overfiring. Look for pots that are slumped or where it looks like the fabric of the clay is literally starting to come apart. These are signs of overfiring. The next problem I'm going to talk about is the opposite of overfiring. It's underfiring. That's where the clay doesn't even get hot enough to turn it into ceramic. I went through a period of time where I was doing a lot of underfiring and I wasn't even aware of it until I moved into a new house and I had all these boxes of pottery I didn't know what to do with. It was kind of like the pottery was too crummy to give away as gifts or to sell, but yet it was too nice to just throw in the trash. And so I decided I was going to decorate my yard with it. I put it under trees and I lined walkways with it, and it looked real nice until the pottery started getting exposed to weather and rain. And then some of that pottery started to fall apart. And that's how I found out that I had been underfiring some of my pottery. Now in some cases it was the body clay that was underfired and the whole pot would fall apart. But in other cases, it was just the slip that was underfired and the body was just fine. And that's because, just like overfiring, underfiring depends on the specific clay you're using. And each clay will have different requirements for what temperature it needs to become ceramic. So you need to know your clays well and know what temperature you need to reach when you fire them. One of the best ways to avoid underfiring your pottery is to get yourself one of these infrared thermometers. And then as you're firing, you can just go around and hit the pot in different places and make sure it all gets up to the required temperature to make it into ceramic. Now there's other ways you can tell. You can kind of get a feel for the clay and know when it's got hot enough by the way it looks. But that takes a lot of experience. And the infrared thermometer can take a lot of the experience out of knowing. You can usually get these for under $100. But when you do, make sure you get one that goes up to at least 1000 degrees Celsius. A lot of the infrared thermometers they sell for home use don't go high enough to measure a pottery firing. I'll put a link to the one I use down in the doobly-doo in case you're interested in getting an infrared thermometer. The third problem with outdoor pottery firing that I'm going to talk about is under-oxidizing. Now this is just when the pottery doesn't oxidize enough to burn all the carbon out, and so the pots come out dark and kind of gray in color. Now in a lot of traditions or parts of the world, this is traditional. Pots are fired in a hole in the ground, fuel is thrown on top, and it's all kind of jumbled together down there and the pots come out gray. This is traditional and the way it's intended. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with under-oxidizing your pottery if that's what you're going for. But if you're looking for those bright colored potteries like we have in the Southwest, if you're trying to make polychromes and you want bright whites and bright reds or yellows or whatever you're going for, then you want to thoroughly oxidize the pottery in order to burn all the carbon off of it. And that requires that you have lots of airspace around your pots. So when you put the pots in the firing, you stack them up on rocks so air can get under the pot. When you stack the fuel and you stack the pottery together in the firing, you stack it in such a way that there's airspace so that hot air can circulate and that oxygen can burn the carbon off. You can also use cover sherds to keep the fuel off of the pottery. So these are things you can do to help your pottery oxidize better and prevent those under-oxidized pots. The fourth problem we're going to talk about is thermal shock. Now we're getting to problems that are pretty common. This is something that a lot of people deal with. This is when the pot is heating up too quickly or cooling off too quickly and it cracks because it can't stand the shock of that. There's a couple of ways to prevent thermal shock problems. One is to make sure the pot heats up nice and slow and cools down nice and slow. You could put a lot of cover sherds around it to kind of protect it from that radiant heat and that sharp spike of temperature when the fire gets started. And then keeping those cover sherds and those hot coals over the pot while it cools for a long period and allowing it to cool down slowly can also prevent a cool breeze from coming in and hitting that hot pot and causing it to crack. The other thing you can do to prevent thermal shock is add more temper to your clay. So when you get thermal shock cracks in your pottery, that's a good clue that you haven't used enough temper in your clay. Especially in situations where you're trying to oxidize the pots a lot and you don't want to use a lot of cover sherds. You kind of want to fire in an open environment. In those cases especially, you want to make sure you have plenty of temper in your clay to prevent the thermal shock that will inevitably happen. And the fifth problem with outdoor pottery firing that we're going to talk about, and this is the most common of all, is not properly preheating your pottery. So clay naturally has moisture in it. It doesn't matter how long ago you made the pot, whether it was days, weeks, months, even years, there can still be moisture in that clay body. In some cases, the pot can absorb moisture right out of the atmosphere if there's humidity in the air. And in other cases, there's molecular moisture that's in the clay, and only preheating can drive that moisture off. Because if you put that pot in the fire and start firing it without preheating it, that moisture can try to escape and blow off a piece of the pot. This is usually seen in the form of spalls on the outsides and especially the bottoms of pots that weren't properly preheated. There's a couple of ways that pots are usually preheated. One is to stick them in your oven on low for a half hour or so, and the other is just to set the pots around the fire and allow them to warm up as you build up that bed of coals to start your firing. Make sure you rotate them every once in a while so they get preheated all over, on the bottom, on the top, on all sides. If you apply the tips in this video, you can prevent most outdoor pottery firing breakages and have a good success rate. Now, I talked about ways to prevent it, and one of those was that infrared thermometer, which can help you know if you're getting close to overfiring your pottery, if you're underfiring your pottery. It's a big help. Another one of those helps I talked about was cover sherds. Cover sherds can protect your pottery from that radiant heat that can cause thermal shocks. It can prevent your pottery from heating too quickly or cooling too quickly. Now, I have a video all about cover sherds and how to make them, and I'm going to put that right over here. So go check that out, learn how to make your own cover sherds, and prevent outdoor pottery firing problems. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.